Today we're answering more viewer questions, and that question is, how do you come up with a really good podcast name? I got the answer for you coming up next. Stick around. Hey, thanks for watching. My name is the Shan Man, radio broadcaster, podcaster, and podcast producer. And today we're answering viewer questions that are left in the comment sections of my videos. And some of the best questions that I get are in the comment section. And that's also where you can find some of the best answers too, because I do get back to some of those comments. So if you ever have a question or you have a comment, make sure that you are commenting on this video and previous videos. I promise to get back to you as soon as I can possibly humanly do, all right? Today's question comes from Carrie, and she's looking to start a podcast based around her photography business. And she asks the question, or really she had a statement, and I'm going to go ahead and read it off of my phone here. And her statement on in the comment section of one of my videos was, I'm struggling between coming up with a name that's memorable and clever without needing to rely on the tagline to let the searching person know exactly what my podcast is all about. And I'm paraphrasing, of course, right there. And that's a great statement and, of course, query and question that Carrie's asking there. How do you come up with a quality podcast name? Now, when it comes down to the creation process and you're in that state of like getting everything together and all your materials together to start podcasting, the name is going to be either something that is predetermined or you still haven't come up with it. And the name shouldn't be the one thing that is holding you back. So let's consider a couple of things when it comes down to naming your podcast. Number one, do you want your podcast name to be search engine optimized? Or number two, do you want your podcast name to be clever and memorable? There are two answers, and there's different philosophies that revolve around why you would name your podcast one way versus the other way. Neither way is going to be right, but it's just something for you to think about and something for you to chew on when it comes down to the launch of your podcast. Again, I'm going to reiterate this over and over. Don't let the name of your podcast be the one thing that is hindering you from launching your podcast. So let's talk about number one. Is your podcast going to be search engine optimized? Search engine optimization means that the name is something that is going to be searchable inside of Google. So if we take, for example, the Social Media Marketing Podcast by Michael Stelzner, if you go into Google or you go into Apple or you go into Stitcher and you're searching out Social Media Marketing Podcast, his likely is going to come up because it is search engine optimized. It is a key phrase that is probably looked up more than we can have even imagine. So on Michael's part, that was a very strategic move on his part to create a podcast that revolves around these key words. And of course, it fits Michael's brand because that's what Michael's whole brand is all about. It's all about social media marketing. So it was a very smart move on his part. Now, should you do something like this? Depends. Do you want to have an accompanying business that is going to go along with those words? Or are you trying to do it to just get more ears on your podcast? You have to really think about these things when it comes down to naming your podcast because it's going to affect you later on down the line, and you certainly don't want to rename the podcast, all right? So there are some downsides to doing or naming your podcast that is something search engine optimized, and that is because you may change over the course of time. In Michael's case, he's not changed and he doesn't want to change that name because he knows it gives him more bang for his buck, more value, and his listeners more value. Now let's look at the other side of the coin. Let's talk about a creative name for a podcast. What makes a good podcast name? The name that is good for you, quite honestly. It's going to be the name that fits for you and your brand. It's going to fit for you and your podcast. So think of a name that is going to fit for you and that is going to be memorable for you. So let me give you a couple tips on what to look for whenever you're creating a podcast, all right? Don't rush the name of your podcast, but certainly don't make it the one thing that is holding you back. Again, I'm reiterating, these are the things that are keeping people from launching their podcast. So what I recommend that you do is that you give it about a week. And during that week, what I would like you to do is I would like you to write down potential names of your podcast. This is what I did when I named my podcast. I wrote down a list of potential names. And I came up with the best one that I thought that fit for me. All right. So don't leave the podcast names in your head. Get them out of your head and onto paper, because there's no better way to understand and see how a podcast name will look if it's not written down on paper. So make sure you write it down on paper and then start choosing from that point forward, or just kind of reducing down to the best ones, the best three. And then from that point forward, you can go ahead and name your podcast. Another tip that you can use is think of common phrases and words that are used in your industry or in your niche for your podcast. So if we think about a podcast about people who are about ready to turn 30, what are some common phrases that you have in conversation? When you have a conversation, you're at the bar or maybe you're at the restaurant and someone asks you, hey, how old are you going to be? Or how old are you right now? And you say, I'm almost 30. Those are common phrases, and almost 30 is an actual podcast name. If you go give it a look, that is something that is out there. So what are the aphorisms and the sayings that you're using in your industry or just everyday conversation that's going to help you name your podcast? There's a podcast that one of my friends has started called You've Been Erased, and it's a podcast that it reviews 80s and 90s action movies, and You've Been Erased is all part of something that Arnold Schwarzenegger has said in that movie, I believe, Eraser. So that is where they came up with the name of that podcast. And then, of course, in the case of my podcast, Be The Experience, that's a very personal name for me, and that's something that I chose because it has meaning and value for me behind it, and it's up to me to market my podcast out there with that particular name. So I hope that gives you some ideas. One other tip that I want to share with you is leave the word podcast out of your name because it's really just wasting space when it comes down to it. The description of your podcast is going to be written somewhere inside of Libsyn and in Blueberry, and that will describe what your podcast is about, and you can write the word podcast in there. But as far as the titling of your name, you don't need to put podcast in there. So let's ask the question one more time. What makes a good podcast name? It's going to be all dependent on you and your due diligence to market your podcast to the audience that is going to find your content inspirational, interesting, educational, entertaining. Your podcast name is going to be the one that is going to resonate with the audience that understands and likes your content the most when they come to listen to it every week. So make your name a good one, come up with it, and stick with it, okay? If you like this video, go ahead and leave it a thumbs up, and of course, a comment down below if you have questions about anything else, maybe with naming a podcast, or maybe just go ahead and ask a question that you're confused on when it comes down to podcasting. I would really appreciate it. And of course, subscribe to the button down below on YouTube if that's where you're watching this, and share this out on Twitter, share this out on Facebook, on LinkedIn, Pinterest. I don't care where you're sharing it. Just share it with your friends who are looking to start a podcast, because likely the information that I'm sharing here is going to help them in their podcast journey. And while we're on that topic, if you are starting a podcast for the very first time and you're looking for some type of information on how to start your very first podcast, go ahead and download my quick start guide on how to start a podcast in 4 simple steps. I'll go ahead and leave that that link up here below, or up here or down below in the description, and you can go ahead and download it right there. And of course, if you want more, you can find this video on a blog on my website at theshanman.com. Again, thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon.